You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and today I'm talking to Matthew Dickerson, who's in Studio 2 with me, live for a change, I might add. So it's really good to see you, Matthew.
Thank you, Tony. It is a bit different, isn't it? We're used to being on the phone.
Yes.
Talk about being live on the phone,
Yes.
Now live in the studio. It's good to see you in the flesh.
Absolutely. Not quite live on the air, but best thing, really.
Yeah. No, it's good to be in the studio for a change.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about a number of different things, but last Thursday evening there was the standing committee meetings where there was a whole raft of things that was discussed, and so we'd like to talk about some of those things. But before we do, let's get on to where you've been this morning. So first up, you're at the biggest morning tea.
At the senior citizens room there,
Yep.
the biggest morning tea. And I do get to that particular area there a few times throughout the year. There's different events held there, and I really enjoy it. There's a group of senior citizens that are very focused. You can go there and you don't need to have eaten, Tony, for about 3 days beforehand, because the amount of food that they put on, I think everyone in the room brings something along for the morning tea or for whatever event that's on. I've been there for lunches, morning teas, a great spread put on. But it's a great way just to talk to people, and typically you'll get 30, 40 different people come along there. Some of the aged care facilities, so Maranatha, for example, might bring along some people as well. So it's a really good feeling. And today was about raising money for the biggest morning tea, about cancer fundraiser.
Yeah.
There's different events that are held there. But I enjoy it for a few reasons. One, I just go around and sit down and talk to some people about different things. I'll do a bit of Q&A, get some feedback from the audience about what's happening around Wellington. And of course, they normally ask for a poem as well. So of course, I did a poem for them again this morning, just recited a poem for them. But it's a nice feeling, and it's a good chance to come down to Wellington. I probably end up being in Wellington once or twice a week, just about every week. So there's lots of things happening down here, and that's always good to see.
Absolutely, it is. Now, talking to some of the citizens there, some of the people with your Q&A, there was a few issues that they raised, and one of those was, well, I'll put two together and you can just go from there. But
Sure.
Now, talking about access in shops, with stairs and openings and things like that for people that are aged or infirm or whatever. And the other question was, how many dogs are people allowed to keep in their residential area?
Yeah, so the answer to those two questions, the first one is, and again, you can imagine with that audience, there's some people that might be using walking sticks, even some people in wheelchairs. So disability access, ramps, that type of things into some of the shops. And so one of the people said, what can council do about shops that don't have some form of disability access? And in a very short paraphrasing, what I explained is that planning laws typically are not retrospective. In very rare circumstances they are, but typically when someone got an approval for their shop 10, 20, 30 years ago, whenever it might have been, that approval still stands. There's a thing called existing use rights. So if they've been using it with that approval, been using it consistently, then if new laws come in, so for example, in relation to disability access, they don't get applied retrospectively. If a new DA was put in today, for example, then yes, you would need to have compliance with the current laws, including disability access. So what I suggest in this case is council doesn't have the power and therefore won't do anything about the disability access for existing shops. But if I was someone that was using those shops regularly and that was an issue, then I would say to the owner or the shopkeeper there, can you look at how you can possibly do something about disability access? It may be cost prohibitive for them, it may be worthwhile for them to do it, but certainly that's an issue there. And then the dogs, the interesting part about dogs is there's no set limit numerically for how many dogs you can have. But you do have to be able to keep those dogs in humane conditions or in conditions that are looking after the health of those dogs. So if someone's got a very small yard and they've got 50 dogs, then it would be pretty easy to argue that there's not a big enough yard to sustain 50 dogs in a reasonable way, in a way that's not being cruel to those animals. Some people said to me that they thought the limit was 2 or 3. Someone else said, no, it's definitely 5. I said, no, there isn't a numerical limit. But if you've got someone, a neighbour near you or someone that you know that isn't looking after those dogs, it doesn't matter how many dogs are there, it could be one dog and it's not being looked after, then definitely contact council and ask for the rangers to go around and have a look at those dogs.
Oh, good God. So people can make sensible decisions rather than having mandated decisions these days. That's a pretty rare thing, I have to say.
It's touch and go, Tony. Well, sometimes they're mandated, sometimes they're common sense.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. Now, the other big thing that's happening, there's an opening this week in Wellington for Squadron Energy. They're opening a shop front. So that's very interesting. It's showing a number of things. First of all, the commitment Squadron Energy is looking to have towards Wellington, and also the fact that this is actually quite a big project.
Well, the good thing about this is, Tony, you're right, I'll be back down here on Wednesday. Squadron Energy will be opening their office. So that means office space taken up, more shops in the main street. Now, it's not a retail shop that people are going to go and visit on a regular basis, but I like to see as few vacant shops as possible down the main street. And there are a few vacancies at the moment, so I think that means there's an opportunity. Squadron will also have staff employed in the office there. I don't know how many staff, I'll find out more on Wednesday when I come back down.
Yep.
But again, it's more employment. But you're right, it does indicate just how serious Squadron, and in the broader scheme of things, the renewable energy zone, just how serious that is for this area and money that will be injected. So it won't just be people out on the sites constructing wind towers or solar farms. There'll be people involved in admin, people involved in ongoing maintenance, people involved in this case for Squadron Energy being there in an office. So we're seeing already, some of these projects, we're seeing money being injected into the economy already, and we're at the very start, Tony. There are 37 projects at various stages of planning in this area, renewable projects in this area.
Yep.
So there's a fair bit to go yet. And again, the economy, if we as in council can get it right, the economy of Wellington will look dramatically different in 10 years' time to what it looks now. And again, that's the challenge that I have almost put on myself and councillors to make sure that we gain every possible benefit we can from the res for Wellington.
Okay, now this also supplies me with the great opportunity to segue straight into the standing committee meeting in relation to what's going on with the Burrendong wind farm and the arrangements you're going to be looking at having towards grant funding and that sort of thing.
So this is all about the Community Benefits Fund.
Yes.
And what our challenge is, one of the things that we've talked about before, Tony, is the frustrating part for council is for all of these projects, for wind farms, for solar farms, for batteries, any of those projects, there's no compulsory process where they have to pay money to the local community in terms of the Community Benefit Fund. There are guidelines around it, there are things that are set there that they've got to have some discussions, but we as in council are not the consent authority. The state government's the consent authority, but part of the process is they've got to have some discussions with the local council about some of these various community benefit funds. Our challenge is to make sure we get what's fair and reasonable for the community out of these projects to put some money back into the community. We've got a policy framework, guidelines that we've put together, that we created, that we present to these various proponents and say, we think 1.5% of the total value of this project spread out over the next 20, 30 years, whatever it might be, indexed each year, is a fair and reasonable approach. And we've been successful with most, not all of those with that. I can't, this particular part that you mentioned there was discussed as a confidential part of the meeting. I can only talk about the outcome.
Sure.
And the outcome is that basically we've got a process we're going down, we're having negotiations, councillors have approved those negotiation levels. When we finally get to the end stage and that VPA is hopefully signed off on by the proponent and by council, it'll become public at that stage. But we're still in that negotiation stage, so it's still confidential. But let me assure you and your listeners, we are very focused on making sure that these res projects, all of these renewable projects, deliver financial benefits for the community. If we don't get that right, all of this work that's being done in the area won't benefit Wellington as much as it could have.
Okay, so would you say the draft management plan is progressing, and do you think it's going to take much longer to sign off on?
No, usually I'm finding the proponents are pretty good. They'll have discussions first of all. Our staff will then bring it back to council for formal endorsement. And we've usually got to the point where when it gets to that level, the proponent is usually vaguely comfortable with where we're at, and then it's just up to councillors to endorse that. Then it goes back for final sign-off, and then it becomes public as part of that process. So yes, progressing well. One of the frustrations I have, Tony, and I've certainly had or taken this up with both federal and state governments, is it takes multiple meetings for each of these various negotiations to happen. We've got 37 of these projects, so multiply that by, say, 3 or 4 meetings, going back to council meetings. There's a lot of staff time taken up with all of that process for each individual VPA. Now, it's worth it for us because these VPAs deliver money, but surely there's got to be a better streamlined way to make all that happen.
Yeah, well, you know, the latest one that's been announced is, or that's in the pipeline at least, is the pumped hydro at Burrendong Dam. That's going to be an interesting one. That's a very big project.
Yeah, you're right. And that's another one, Tony, where we'll try and have some discussions, negotiations about pumped hydro. There's no real standard out there. We'll start with our standard 1.5% and go from there. But I have stressed and it's in the state government's hands, but I think the federal government could actually do something from a guideline perspective. And I've actually got a conference coming up called the National General Assembly in Canberra. And one of the motions that our councillors put to that overall conference is to have some guidelines, because this applies across the nation, have some guidelines from the federal government. So we'll see how we go with that debate. But if the state government said there's an amount, whatever that amount is, it's a compulsory part of the process, we could save a lot of time with all these negotiations and just know, oh, another project, oh,
Yep.
good, that's a $1 billion project. We know we're going to get 1.5% or whatever the number might be out of that project. We can plan on that. But at the moment, there's a lot of time taken with negotiations.
This should have been thought about a lot better than this by the state government, really, when you consider it.
Yeah, you're right.
Some guidelines and some sort of mandated commitments too, I think would have been a good thing to look at.
Well, I think there's two parts. I think the state government should have mandate. So it should be, this is what you will pay to the local community and community benefits fund as a result of this particular project. Because the state governments across the nation are taking care of those local planning decisions, it will be much harder for the federal government to mandate it. So the federal government could have a guideline that says, across the nation, this is what should happen, and then each individual state government could apply those guidelines. We also don't want a situation, Tony, where the state government in New South Wales says, right, you should have 1.5% payable, this is what it should look like. And then Queensland government says, in Queensland it's only 0.5%. And then some developments say, well, we'll go to Queensland because it's cheaper to do developments there than it is in New South Wales. We don't want them picking states over states.
Yep.
We want them looking at the same rules being applicable across the entire nation. I think would make sense.
Yeah, it would certainly, yeah. Okay, well, now just looking at the figures, the building summary, there was, we're looking at approvals for residential dwellings at 378 currently for this financial year. Interesting that there was only 12 in May. I hope that's not an indication of what's happening with the building industry locally. It might just be an aberration for the month, of course. You're only looking at 1 month. But certainly in Wellington, there is a shortage of housing here, particularly housing of a particular type that people are looking for, modern housing. People come to Wellington and usually find they need to build.
And there's a couple of things there. So I'm the same as you. I hope it's just an aberration. The building approvals certainly were lower in May than we'd like to see them be normally. One of the things obviously is you see a number that's a bit different to previous months and you wonder whether it's a one-off or whether it's a trend. We won't really know that until we look to future months. Talking to our planning staff, there certainly are projects still coming in, and sometimes it's a matter of getting everything to line up before those approvals are given, because this is, remember, on approvals, not on applications. So the numbers we report are approvals. We'll look at that. The numbers for the year are going to be down a little bit over last year, but they'll still be fairly strong. They'll be up over 400, and so that's a reasonable number throughout the year still, I think. Get into the Wellington issue, certainly that's one of the areas where we're saying we're encouraging development in Wellington, because we think some of the reses, the amount of housing that will be needed by workers, employers, etc. of the reses will be very important for Wellington, and we think that's a way to leave a lasting legacy for Wellington, to have more housing built here, more availability of housing. Development takes time. There's probably some development happening in Dubbo as a result of the res as well, but there were some developers that already had blocks ready to go, so it's probably a bit easier for them. We again want to encourage that sort of development, and even just talking about the fact there's that development potential there. This Wednesday night, Tony, we've got another one of the Mayoral Developers Forums. I started these way back in 2011. Part of the reason I started those was because I wanted to make sure the communication about what was happening out there was known by the development market. So when we have those developments, one of the discussions, absolutely, I guarantee, we'll be having on Wednesday night with all the people in the room, there'll be 60 or 70 people in the room, will be, don't forget about Wellington. Wellington's got a huge amount of potential for development, and maybe you can do some great developments in Wellington. So, and I've had that discussion with various developers, so I know developers are looking at it. It's sometimes what they're familiar with, and they might be familiar with developments in Dubbo more so than Wellington. So you kind of look at some of those things and say, we need to be talking to people. We can't make people do it, but need to be talking to people to know what the opportunities are, Tony. Okay.
Well, you've answered that question before I was able to ask it. So that's really good. And I hope to see that there's some positive plans by companies and other organisations with the encouragement of council to see some outcomes with that. Now, one thing I didn't mention to you earlier, which I probably should have, was the Wellington Caves Service Review management response. Where are we at with that, do you think?
So one of the things that's important that we're doing in all of the businesses of council, and even though some people think that some areas aren't a business, so water, for example, is a business of council, sewer is a business of council, we need to run each of those as individual units. Now, sometimes they're subsidised. So our swimming pools, for example, are subsidised by our ratepayers. So it's a business that loses money, but it's still got to be run as much as possible as a business. The Wellington Caves certainly loses money at the moment, but a very important tourism attraction for Wellington, for the whole region. It's something that we don't see cave systems like that managed by local government really anywhere else in the state, probably anywhere else in the nation even. We've got to work out the best way we can manage that. We've got a caravan park out there, we've got the caves obviously. There's also a golf club. The golf club's not owned by council as such, but looking at the best way to manage all of that, looking at whether or not we invest significant amounts of money out there to get a good return long term, or whether we reduce the amount of expenditure, reduce the expenses there, and try and make sure we can keep as little subsidisation as possible happening out there. All of this, we're doing this across different business units, across council, Tony. The idea here is that we should always be doing that. Any business does it, any business plans for what they're doing in the future, looks at all of their different structures and see how they're looking. We're doing the same with council. There's no definitive outcome I can say to you as a result of the review where it's up to now. We're going to make this change with the caves. It's still in that planning phase at the moment, still looking at it, investigating, looking at different options there. Some people have talked about, wouldn't it be fantastic to have one common facility out there that managed the golf course, the caravan park and the caves. And that sounds fantastic. The only problem is the golf course is owned by a separate entity, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. There's still potential for that to happen. Is that something we can look at? What are we best to do to plan and manage that going forward? And that's something that we're doing across, again, all of our different business units.
Okay, well, of course, the Wellington Soldiers Club, Memorial Club that is contemplating or looking at, and it's in the process of acquiring the golf club and managing that. So that's probably a good step forward. It'll be better resourced, and that would mean potentially better managed as well because they've got the resources to do that.
Quite possibly, and that might be something, again, there's no reason we can't have those discussions to say having some common place you went to. So imagine going to the caves and you go to a common check-in, whether it be you're playing golf or you go in the caravan park or you go and visit the caves. That might make it more economical from a staffing perspective, for example. Now, I'm not saying that's what we're doing, it's just those type of things we need to be thinking about. We always need to be thinking forward, thinking in advance, thinking what will this look like in 5, 10, 20 years' time, but also keep an eye on the bottom line. We want to make sure we're giving the best value possible for ratepayers.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving on to the next thing, the community input survey results. Interesting, I thought. Now, I got the summary of that, as you know. I looked at the focus group data, which I thought, well, what the hell is that doing there? It doesn't mean anything. Focus group data is not representative statistically. That was a 58% of those people, they were somewhat satisfied with the performance of the council. But the figure that really matters, that tells you the true story, is that 81% of people who undertook the phone survey, now that's a random survey, that's the difference, not a focus group survey, they were satisfied. So that looks like an improvement over the previous council, doesn't it?
A couple of things there, and you're spot on, Tony. A random selection, so when we engage a survey company, a random selection of people, you don't need a lot of people to be randomly selected to get a statistically valid survey. So in this case, 500 was their target number, so they were targeting to get to 500, which they had to get as part of the contract. So that's a little bit less than 1% of the population. But again, when it's a random selection, that gives you a statistically valid survey,
Absolutely.
plus or minus certain margins.
Yeah.
So that's the information that we as councillors looked into, drilled into, had a workshop with the survey company to really get that information. And that's where you pick that 81% figure from. So the people that are somewhat satisfied with the performance of council, 81%. We also do a self-selection survey. Now, I question the value of this, to be honest. I just am not sure whether or not there's anything we can read from it, because if it's a self-selected survey, as you correctly said, it doesn't have the same statistical validity as a random selection. And typically, even the survey company said, typically with a self-selection, you'll get people that are usually unhappy, annoyed, they've got something, a problem they want to deal with. And the survey results, the information that came in, it tended to be, the survey company said that the people that self-selected, that did the survey themselves, typically tended to be people who had an issue, one issue with council, and really that was their focus in the open-ended questions they had. The focus seemed to be very much about one issue they've had with council. It might have been an issue with some cats and dogs, or it might have been an issue with some planning, or might have been some sort of issue with the tip, whatever it might have been, that seemed to be their focus, but they're unhappy with council because of that one issue. So it wasn't really a good representative sample, but it probably gave people a chance to vent and really put the information there. We still read the information that comes through. We still read the open-ended question and the answers to those. So from that perspective, you can do that anyway. You can send emails into council. You can have feedback by your say about different things. So I would say, Tony, that there's the opportunity all throughout the year, every day, every minute of every day, to give that feedback. I give my email address out, my phone number out. People can give us that feedback. I go to senior citizens events and people can give me that direct feedback there as well. So it's interesting. But the other survey, the one that was the random selection, some pretty good information in there about what's happening in the community.
Okay, so the devil's always in the detail. So the words used there were somewhat satisfied. So what's all the other parameters that were looked at and measured?
So that basically was a ranking system, if you like. I think it was out of 5. So you said, what's your satisfaction level with council?
That's true, yes.
So it was basically, I think 5 was perfectly satisfied, and 4 was very satisfied, and 3 was somewhat satisfied, and 2 was dissatisfied, and 1 was very dissatisfied.
Yes.
So I think that was basically the people that put 3 and above went into the somewhat satisfied category. So, and that was a common across the survey, where it was that ranking system where you had different levels of satisfaction.
Okay, very good. So it will still be interesting to see what percentages each ticked those different areas.
Yeah, and you can look at all that information there. That was just one headline figure, but you're right, your initial comment, that's certainly been on the improve, so that's fantastic. And again, it's not a bad number in terms of councils across the state. 81% is a good number, but also means room for improvement, which is good as well.
Okay. Now, I always get questions in between all my discussions with you, Matthew, and also with the CEO. And those questions usually hinge around what's happening still with the bridges situation, particularly with the low-level bridge. We know, of course, we've got the pedestrian walk across there now, which is fantastic, and that's very much appreciated. So what's the status quo?
So the status quo is the status quo. So the pedestrian bridge, we've spoken about that before. We've now spent a little bit of money, not too much, but a little bit of money in delivering pedestrian access across the old Duke of Wellington Bridge. So that's a good start. As you know, we're talking about in the vicinity of $23 million to actually restore all of that area, and not so much the bridge, but the riverbank around there from the Bell River, restore that to its former glory and make sure it's safe for the long term. And that's where we're still chasing that money, still waiting on any answers back from that. We've got no response in any indication with which way that might go at this stage, but we're still chasing that money there. Hopefully it'll be yes. If it's not, it'll be a no or something to work on, but I'll let you know once we find out about that one.
Okay, so the lion's share of that money you would expect come from the state government, I would imagine.
Absolutely right, yeah. We don't have the budget for that kind of money at the moment to put into the restoration work there. So yes, we would need that money, a significant amount of that money from the state government.
Okay. Well, we've been discussing many different things with you, Matthew. I'm very much appreciative that you've come in to do that today. So thanks very much for that.
Always my pleasure, Tony, and it is. It's good to sit in the studio, and I love the new work you've done in the studio as well. Well done on that work.
Oh, we've got a long way to go yet. Anyway, we've been talking to Matthew Dickerson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, on Binjang 91.5.